the night he raised a rifle in his own doorway. He realized the girl he never meant to choose might be the one he couldn't afford to lose. The door slammed open so hard it rattled the hinges, wind howling through the cracks like it meant to tear the place apart. Ruby's back hit the counter, her fingers tightening around the knife as boots scraped closer across the floor. The smell of whiskey, wet leather, and storm dust filled the room. Then a sharp click cut through it all. Wade stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hat, the rifle steady in his hands, and no one moved. What he did next would change everything between them. Stay with me. This story doesn't unfold the way you think. The wind had a way of scraping across Red Mesa like it was trying to peel the land apart, carrying dust that settled into every seam and pocket and quiet thought a person might have. By late afternoon, the road into town looked less like a road and more like a pale scar dragged through the earth. Nothing moved unless it had to. The wagon came in slow, wheels grinding over loose stone. No one stopped what they were doing to watch it arrive. A man leaned against the post outside the general store, whittling something down to nothing. Two women stood near the well, talking low, their skirts stirring in the wind. They all saw it. None of them made a show of it. Ruby Ellis sat at the back of the wagon, hands folded in her lap, a small case resting against her boots. The leather had cracked along the edges. She kept one hand on the handle like it might slip away if she didn't. Her dress had once been dark green. Out here, it had taken on the color of dust. The driver didn't speak when he pulled the reins, just nodded once toward the church steps. "This is as far as I go." Ruby stepped down on her own. Her shoes met the ground without a sound. The wind lifted the edge of her skirt and let it fall again. She didn't look around right away, just stood there long enough to feel the weight of the place settle on her. Inside the church, it was cooler. A narrow strip of light came through the side window and fell across the floorboards. Reverend Pike stood near the front, papers in hand, spectacles low on his nose. He cleared his throat when she approached. "You're Miss Ellis, yes, sir." He glanced toward the open door, as if expecting someone else to follow her in. No one did. He shifted the papers once, then twice, then handed them over. "Mr. Callahan has agreed to the arrangement. Terms are simple. Residence on his property. Shared name under the law. No other obligations stated." Ruby read the lines slowly. The ink had smudged in one corner like someone had pressed too hard. She nodded once and handed the paper back. "I understand." Reverend Pike seemed to wait for something more. When it didn't come, he gave a small nod of his own. "He's outside." Ruby stepped back into the light. Wade Callahan stood near the hitching rail, one hand resting on the neck of a bay horse. He didn't turn right away when the door opened, just kept his gaze out toward the low hills, where the sky met the land in a thin, wavering line. He was taller than she expected, broad across the shoulders, coat worn smooth at the seams. His hat cast a shadow that kept most of his face hidden, but what showed looked set in a way that didn't invite questions. Ruby walked the few steps toward him and stopped. "Mr. Callahan." He turned then. His eyes moved over her once. Not slow, not quick. Just enough. "You're Ellis, yes, sir." The wind shifted between them. Somewhere down the road, a loose board knocked against a fence post in a steady rhythm. Wade nodded once, like he had come to the end of a thought. "You'll have a roof," he said. "That's all I can promise." Ruby held his gaze. There was no weight behind the words, no softness either. Just truth, plain and unpolished. "That's enough," she said. He studied her for a moment longer, as if measuring something that didn't have a name. Then he turned back to the wagon. "Load your things." She picked up her case. It felt lighter than it should have. No one came to see her off. The two women by the well had gone. The man at the store had moved on to something else. The town closed in behind her without a sound. Ruby climbed into the wagon and settled onto the wooden seat. Wade took the reins. The horse shifted once, then started forward. The wheels rolled. The church grew smaller in the distance. The road stretched out ahead, pale and empty. Ruby didn't look back. The wind rose again, dragging dust across the path until it swallowed the tracks almost as soon as they were made. Wade kept his eyes on the horizon. Ruby kept her hands folded in her lap. Between them, there was space enough for a question. Neither of them asked it. The road narrowed as they left town behind. The land opened wide, dry grass bending in slow waves under the wind. Now and then a fence post leaned crooked, wire humming faintly as the breeze ran through it. Wade didn't hurry the horse. He drove like a man who knew exactly how far he had to go and saw no reason to arrive any sooner. Ruby sat still beside him, her hands folded the same way they had been since the church. Dust gathered along the hem of her dress again. She brushed it once, then let it be. They reached the ranch near sundown. The gate hung slightly off its hinge. Wade stepped down first, lifting the latch with one hand while holding the reins with the other. The horse walked through on its own. Ruby climbed down after, her boots landing on packed dirt worn smooth by years of use. The house stood a little way back, timber walls, sun-faded. One shutter loose on the west side, tapping soft against the frame. No smoke from the chimney. No movement in the yard except a water trough rocking gently where the wind caught it. Wade tied the horse without a word and carried her case inside. The door opened with a low groan. Inside, the air held the smell of wood, iron, and something long settled. A table stood near the window. 2 chairs. A stove with a dent along its side. Everything in its place. Nothing soft about it. Wade set the case down near the wall. "Room's through there," he said, nodding toward a narrow hallway. "Water's in the barrel out back. Coffee tins by the stove." Ruby gave a small nod. He didn't wait for more. Took off his hat, hung it on a nail, then stepped back outside like the house hadn't asked him to stay. Ruby stood where she was for a moment. The silence inside was different from the one in town. It didn't press. It just stayed. She walked to the sink, ran her fingers along the edge. Clean, but unused. The kind of clean that comes from being left alone too long. In the small room off the hall, a bed waited. Blanket folded tight. A window cracked open just enough for the wind to whisper through. She set her case down and didn't open it. By the time she stepped back into the kitchen, the light had shifted. Wade came in carrying a small sack, flour by the look of it. He set it on the table, pulled a chair, and sat. From his coat pocket, he took out a folded receipt, glanced at it once, then slid it aside. No greeting, no question. Ruby moved to the stove, lifted the lid. Cold. She found the kindling stacked in a crate, struck a match, and waited for the flame to catch. The wood took slowly, then all at once. The small fire filled the room with a low, steady crackle. Wade watched it for a moment, then looked away. That first evening, they ate without speaking. Beans from a tin, hard bread, coffee poured into 2 mismatched cups. Ruby set his in front of him without asking. He took it with a nod that didn't quite reach his eyes. When the meal was done, he stood, carried his plate to the basin, rinsed it once and set it upside down. "I'm up before sun," he said. "You don't have to be." Ruby wiped her hands on a cloth. "I wake early," she said. He paused, like he might say something else, then didn't. Took his hat and stepped out again, leaving the door to close on its own. The next morning came quiet. Ruby was already at the stove when Wade walked in. The fire had been lit again. A small pan sat over it, something frying slow. The smell reached him before he crossed the threshold. He stopped just inside. Ruby stood with her sleeves rolled, stirring with a steady hand. She didn't look up right away. Just finished what she was doing, then turned. "Morning." Wade didn't answer. Not at first. His eyes moved across the room. Table cleared. floor swept. The loose shutter tied back with a strip of cloth. He stepped closer, pulled out the chair, and sat. She set a plate in front of him. Eggs, thin and crisp at the edges. A piece of bread warmed on the pan. He picked up the fork, took a bite, chewed slow, didn't say a word, but he didn't leave the table right away either. Outside, voices carried from the bunkhouse. Boots on dirt. Laughter, rough and easy. A few of the men drifted closer as the morning stretched. One leaned against the fence, looking toward the house longer than needed. Gus Turner passed by with a nod, eyes steady, not prying. Travis Cole came after, slower. He tipped his hat just enough to count, but his gaze lingered at the window, following the movement inside. Ruby felt it without looking. Inside, the pan hissed softly as the last of the fat burned down. Wade set his fork down, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and stood. He reached for his hat, paused near the door, looked once toward Ruby, then stepped outside into the light. The door closed behind him, leaving the house quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. By afternoon, the wind had changed its mind. It came low at first, sliding along the ground, pushing dust in thin lines across the yard. Then it rose, sharper, carrying a weight that bent the fence wire until it sang. The sky turned the color of old tin. Even the horses shifted in their pen, restless, their hooves striking the boards in uneven rhythm. Ruby stood at the window, one hand resting on the frame. She watched the horizon disappear behind a moving wall of sand and cloud. The loose shutter Wade had tied back knocked once, then again, harder this time. He came in just long enough to grab his coat. "Storm's rolling in fast," he said, already turning. "Herd's out by the south line." Ruby nodded. She didn't ask him to stay. He paused at the door, hand on the latch, like something had caught him mid-thought. His eyes flicked once toward her. Then he stepped out, pulling the door shut behind him, the wind taking hold of it the moment it closed. The house held. For a while. Ruby moved through the rooms with steady hands. She latched what she could, set a heavy chair against the back door, checked the stove, fed the fire until it burned low and even. The kettle rattled once as the wind pushed down the chimney. Outside, the storm came down hard. The sound filled everything. Wood creaking, sand striking the walls in sharp bursts, the kind of noise that made it hard to tell where one thing ended and another began. Ruby sat near the table, listening. Then came the knock. Soft at first, almost lost in the wind. She didn't move. It came again. Louder. Not the wind this time. Ruby stood slowly. "Mr. Callahan?" she called. No answer. Just the storm. The third knock hit the door hard enough to shake it against the frame. Her eyes moved to the table. The knife lay there, still faintly wet from cutting potatoes. She picked it up, her grip tightening around the handle, then walked toward the door without rushing. The latch trembled under the next blow. "Open up," a voice pushed through the wood. Thick, uneven. "Ain't right to keep a man out in this." Ruby didn't answer. The door shook again, harder. The top hinge let out a strained groan. She stepped back. The knife held low but ready, her breath steady in her chest even as the wind roared louder. The wood split along the edge with a sharp crack, and then the door gave. It swung inward, slamming against the wall. Travis Cole stood there, shoulders hunched against the storm, hat gone, hair plastered to his forehead. His coat hung open, soaked through. The smell of whiskey reached her before he took a step inside. "Well now," he said, blinking against the dim light. "Didn't think you'd keep me waiting." Ruby didn't move. "Mr. Callahan ain't here," she said. Travis smiled, slow and crooked. "I know." He stepped forward, boots dragging dirt and rain across the floorboards. The wind shoved at his back until he pushed the door shut with one hand, sealing the noise down to a dull roar. The room felt smaller. Ruby held her ground, the knife steady in her hand. "You should leave," she said. He laughed once under his breath, like the idea didn't quite land. "You don't mean that." Another step. The fire popped behind her, the only other sound in the room. Travis's eyes moved over her, lingering too long, too easy. "Place like this gets lonely," he said. "Figure you might—" The click cut him off. It was quiet, clean, the sound of a rifle being brought to readiness. Travis froze. Ruby didn't turn. Wade stood in the doorway, hat low, coat dark with rain. Water dripped from the brim, hit the floor in steady drops. The rifle rested easy in his hands, not raised, but not lowered either. "Step away from her," he said. His voice didn't carry. It didn't need to. Travis swallowed. The grin slipped off his face like it had never been there. I said step away." The room held still. Travis took one step back, then another. His eyes flicked once to Ruby, then back to Wade. Whatever he saw there made him shift his weight toward the door. "Didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered. Wade didn't answer. He moved just enough to give Travis space. The door opened again, the storm rushing back in as Travis pushed through it, stumbling once before catching himself and disappearing into the wind. Wade closed it behind him. Set the bolt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The knife slipped from Ruby's hand and hit the floor with a dull sound. She didn't pick it up. Wade leaned the rifle against the wall, took off his hat, set it on the table without looking at her. Then he pulled a chair out and sat down. Not close, not far, just there. Ruby lowered herself to the floor where she stood, her back against the wall, her hands resting in her lap like she'd forgotten what to do with them. The fire burned low. The storm pressed against the house, but it didn't come in. Wade didn't ask if she was all right, didn't move toward her. He just stayed, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that wagon, the space around her didn't feel like something she had to guard. The storm passed sometime before dawn. By morning, the air had changed. The dust had settled into the ground, darkened by a thin trace of rain. The yard looked different, as if the land had taken a long breath and let it out slow. Wade was already outside when Ruby stepped onto the porch. He stood near the fence line, checking the posts, pressing one with his boot to test its hold. His coat was gone, sleeves rolled, shirt still damp in places where the rain had soaked through. He didn't look toward the house. Ruby stayed on the step for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe. The wood was cool beneath her palm. She watched him the way a person watches something that has changed without warning. Then she stepped back inside. The house carried a different quiet now. Not empty, just still. She moved through it without thinking, cleared the table, set water to boil. The kettle rattled once, then settled into a steady hum. She found a strip of cloth and tied back the door where the hinge had split. It would hold for now. Later, she walked the narrow hall and noticed a door she hadn't opened before. It stood slightly ajar. She paused. Not out of fear, just habit. Then she pushed it open. The room was smaller than she expected. The air inside held a faint scent of something soft, long faded but not gone. Near the window sat a wooden chest, its lid half open. Light fell across it in a thin line. Inside were folded dresses, pale colors worn at the edges, a small pair of shoes, a ribbon pressed flat between the layers. Ruby didn't touch anything. She stood there long enough for the silence to settle around her again. Behind her, the floor creaked. Wade stood in the doorway. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step forward. "They're gone," he said. Ruby turned. His face didn't change, but something in his eyes had already moved elsewhere, somewhere past the room, past the house. She nodded once. I see that. Neither of them spoke after. Ruby stepped back from the chest, giving the space back without being asked. As she passed him, her hand brushed the edge of the door. His hand rested there too, just above it. Close enough. He didn't pull away. She didn't look at him, but she felt it. That small distance. That choice not to move. She walked back into the kitchen. The fire had burned down low. She added a piece of wood, waited for it to catch. The flame rose slowly, steady again. Outside, the sound of boots on dirt came and went. Voices carried from the far side of the yard, quieter than before. Work had started again. Wade came in sometime after. He didn't mention the room. He sat at the table, hat set beside him, hands resting flat on the wood, as if he'd forgotten what to do next. Ruby placed a cup in front of him. Coffee, dark and thin. He nodded once. They sat like that. Not looking, not speaking. The fire cracked between them. I never knew what to do with a quiet house, he said after a while. His voice was low, almost like he hadn't meant to speak out loud. Until now. Ruby held the edge of the table with her fingers. The wood was worn smooth. She didn't answer. There wasn't anything to answer. That evening came slow. The sky cleared in long streaks of pale gold. The land stretched out clean. The storm pushed far beyond the hills. Ruby folded her few things, not much to gather. A dress, a comb, the small case she'd carried in. She set it near the door, stood there a moment. Then she moved back to the stove, lit the fire again. By the time Wade came in, the room smelled of bread. He stopped just inside the doorway, the same way he had that first morning. His eyes moved from the table, to the fire, to her. The case sat by the door. He looked at it, then at her. Neither of them spoke. Ruby turned back to the stove and lifted the pan. The sound of it, simple and steady, filled the space between them. And the case stayed where it was, unopened, unmoved. Morning came clear and bright, like the storm had never been there at all. Ruby stepped out onto the porch with a tin cup in her hand. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but she held it anyway. The yard still showed signs of the night before. A fence post leaned. One corner of the roof had lost a strip of wood. Nothing beyond repair. Wade was already hitching the wagon. He didn't look up when she stepped down. We're heading into town, he said. Supplies. Ruby nodded once. He handed her a folded scrap of paper. A short list. Flour, salt, kerosene. A note at the bottom in a different hand. Payment due. She glanced at it, then tucked it into her sleeve. The ride into town felt shorter this time. The road had hardened overnight. Wagon tracks from other travelers cut across the dirt, dried into place. They passed a rider once, a man who tipped his hat to Wade and gave Ruby a quick look before riding on. No words were exchanged. By the time they reached the edge of town, the place was already awake. The general store door stood open. A wagon loaded with sacks of grain blocked half the road. Voices carried from the saloon, though it wasn't yet noon. Wade pulled the reins and stepped down first. Ruby followed. They walked side by side, not touching, but not apart either. The space between them had narrowed without either of them noticing when. Inside the store, the air smelled of tobacco, leather, and ground coffee. Mr. Jenkins stood behind the counter, pencil tucked behind his ear. He nodded at Wade. Mornin'. Wade set the list down. Jenkins picked it up, scanned it, then began gathering items without much talk. Ruby moved along the shelves. Her fingers brushed over folded cloth, jars of preserves, a stack of tin cups. She paused near a small mirror nailed to the wall, catching her reflection for a moment. Then she moved on. Behind her, voices shifted. Two men stood near the back, speaking low. Not quiet enough. That's her? Looks like it. Didn't figure Callahan. The rest faded into a murmur, but the tone didn't. Ruby kept her gaze forward. She picked up a sack of flour and carried it to the counter. Wade had heard. He didn't turn right away. Just stood there, one hand resting flat on the wood, the other near the edge of the counter where the receipt lay waiting. Jenkins cleared his throat, pretending not to notice anything at all. The voices behind them grew bolder. Man like him ought to know better. A chair scraped somewhere. Wade reached for the receipt, folded it once, set the coins down beside it. Then he turned. Not fast, not slow, just enough. His eyes moved across the room once, steady, unreadable. The men near the back went quiet. He didn't say anything to them, didn't step closer. Instead, he walked back to where Ruby stood. For a moment, he just looked at her. She met his eyes, didn't ask, didn't step away. Then, without a word, he reached out and took her hand. Simple as that. His grip wasn't tight, but it didn't leave room for doubt. She walks with me, he said. The room held still. No one laughed. No one answered. Jenkins set the last item on the counter a little too carefully, like he was afraid to break something that had already shifted. Wade didn't look back at the others. He kept his hand around hers and led her to the door. Outside, the light felt sharper. The wind had picked up again, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain. They loaded the wagon in silence. Wade climbed up first, then turned and offered his hand. Ruby took it. He helped her up without a word. They didn't let go right away. Back on the road, the town fell behind them. The noise faded. The looks, the voices, just the sound of the wheels again, steady against the dirt. Ruby kept her hand where it had been. So did he. When they reached the ranch, the sun had begun to dip low. Long shadows stretched across the yard. Wade tied the horse, then turned toward the house. Ruby stepped onto the porch ahead of him. The door opened with the same quiet groan as always. Inside, the air felt different again. Not new, just settled. Wade reached into his coat and pulled something out. A folded piece of cloth. He held it for a moment, like weighing it. Then he handed it to her. Ruby unfolded it slowly. A woman's scarf worn soft at the edges. Faded, but clean. She looked up. Wade met her gaze. This house forgot how to live, he said. You didn't. The words hung there. No more followed. Ruby folded the scarf carefully, held it in both hands. Outside, the wind moved through the fence again, softer now. Wade stepped past her into the room. Not close. Not far. Just there. Ruby stood in the doorway a moment longer, the light fading behind her. Then she stepped inside. The door closed, and this time the quiet felt like something that would stay. If you had stood there with Ruby, dust still on your boots, the weight of a place that never asked your name but expected you to prove it, you might have done the same. You might have kept your hands steady, even when they trembled. You might have learned that safety doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes, it sits across the room first. Then it stays. Then, one day, it reaches for your hand in front of the whole world and doesn't let go. Wade never said much. Ruby never asked for more than she was given. But somewhere between the storm and the silence, something took root. Not loud, not sudden, just real. The kind of love that doesn't ask to be believed, only lived. Maybe that's the thing we carry from stories like this. Not that life gets easier, but that it can soften. If someone is willing to stand beside you long enough, if someone chooses you, not with words, but with presence. And maybe the question isn't whether you've ever been chosen. Maybe it's whether you've found the courage to stay when it matters. If a moment like that ever found you, I'd like to hear it. Tell me where you're watching from and what staying looked like in your life. There are more stories waiting just beyond this one. Quiet ones, hard ones, the kind that linger. If you feel like walking a little further, you're always welcome here.